Hello everyone and welcome to our Minerva Lecture. Hopefully we are all ready to go. I can see that there might be a few people in the wrong place at the moment, but hopefully they'll be coming in the next few moments. We're going to have a lecture tonight by James Wallace, who is an old Bradfieldian and he knows what it's like to be a student at Bradfield, and he's now moved on to work in conservation, which is really important to me and to James. And what we're hoping is that by him sharing his story, he'll be able to make you see how wonderful a career conservation might be, and also how important it is to think about our planet in our daily lives. So, if we're ready to go, James?
We are indeed.
Fantastic. I'm going to pass over to him, and then what we're going to do is at the end we'll have some question and answers, so you can type in whenever you like a question and answer into the box, which is the square boxes with the question marks in, and at the end we'll ask those questions to James and see if he can answer them. Okay, off you go, James.
Hi everybody, good evening. My name is James Wallace. I'm going to be sharing with you a presentation tonight which is, I hope, going to be interesting and stimulating for you. I was at Bradfield quite a long time ago. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. My presentation, as you can see, I hope, is Living in a Hothouse World, and a subtitle, A Journey from Extinction to Recovery. I fell in love with the wild life when I was a very young lad, and one of my earliest memories is one of my grandfathers singing a nursery rhyme to me that you can see on the screen, but I'm too embarrassed to read it out myself, but you can see it there. It's a very sweet nursery rhyme. And I also was born at a time in the early 70s, in 1972, when things like flailing hedgerows or even a supermarket or plastic pollution literally didn't exist. Clouds of butterflies did, and they engulfed me. Flocks of starlings murmurated around me, and I have very fond memories in Berkshire, living only just a mile across the fields from where you guys go to school, at Tuts Clump, of abundant wildlife. I spent a lot of time climbing trees and falling out of them. I learned to fish on the Pang, literally in the college, fly fishing, and I was even then aware, or unaware rather, of the absent wildlife that vanished a long time before, animals like white storks, wildcats and beavers. And funny enough, the first time my heart was broken was not by a girl, it was by a crow. I did the classic thing. I found an injured animal, I picked him up, took him back home, put him in a cage, gave him some bread and some milk, and then he promptly died. And it was very upsetting for me. I was very lucky to have a very green-fingered family and green-minded family. My mother was born in Kenya, and her father, my other grandfather, was a great collector of things in Kenya, and I grew up looking at old, what used to be called cine film, of giraffes and the family farm near Nairobi. And I had a collection of birds' nests and preserved giant millipedes and all those sorts of things. And he also, this grandfather, gave me a little moth breeding kit, and I can still remember the smell of it from 40 years ago. I used to breed hawk moths, elephant hawk moths in it, and he and other members of the family were also very much involved in conservation, nature conservation. One of my uncles used to run a game park in Kenya, and also was involved in wildlife security. And another member of the family was a top judge involved in prosecuting people who were in the ivory trade, amongst other things. So I had it in my veins. I came to Bradfield in 1985, and if I can be completely honest with you, I didn't really fit in, even though I was a local lad. I was a bit of a rebel, and I thought of things really quite differently. And as I've titled this slide here, Learning the Old-Fashioned Way, the school you guys are at now is a very different world to what it was in 1985. Obviously the technology was very different, or lacking, one could say, but also the ethos. Unfortunately, in those days, things like bullying existed, and I was bullied. I think probably partly because I was quite irritating and constantly asking questions, and never having enough answers that I thought answered my questions. Also, the way that I was learning and what we were learning about was very much about empires and kings and queens, and it was about mastery of nature. It was learning by rote. It was much less interactive than the education you have now. And also it was very much what we call reductionistic worldview, a mechanistic worldview, which came from scientists like Descartes and Newton, which was all about controlling nature and dominating nature, if you like, which was very important 500 years ago, because we learned to develop technology that allowed us to now have the economy and the global travel and all the things we have now. However, from the world's point of view and nature's point of view, that hasn't worked out very well for the rest of wildlife, as I'm sure you're well aware. So the premise behind the science that I was learning 35, 40 years ago was very much about the sort of kill it, cut it up, put it under a microscope, which was really interesting. I used to love doing that, if I'm honest with you, and really, really inspiring, but it missed the living bits. You didn't really see the living system in its whole. And it was a time when Maggie Thatcher was in government, and individualism was on the rise. So we were being taught, not so much by the school, because that was obviously a very loving community, but generally in society about no such thing as community. So having not really fitted in too well, I had a lot of fun as well, but got into quite a lot of trouble. I started getting into serious trouble, and I'm not ashamed to say this because life's gone on, but I even shoplifted, and I was arrested at age 14. I mean, imagine that. I hope, looking at me now, I look like a relatively respectable person. The very thought of someone doing something like that, it probably tells you how unhappy I was in those days. I really was quite a troubled child. And not surprisingly, after many suspensions and gatings and all this stuff, being caught on the school roof and smoking and many, many worse things that I won't go into, but basically I was a naughty boy and I was kicked out, and I don't blame them really. And I ran to the streets. I lived on the streets. I lived in squats. I developed a very unhealthy attitude to myself and to society. I fell into drugs and to alcohol. And as the picture here, I hope the teachers on this don't mind the swear word, but never mind the bollocks. The Sex Pistols, who some of you may have heard about, were a great inspiration to me, and it reflected a lot of teenage angst that I had and people of my generation with society, with the state of the world, and I was a bit of an angry punk. So I had a head full of piercings. I listened to loud, raucous music, and had far too many dangerous chemicals. I witnessed firsthand poverty, and I'm afraid to say some of the friends that I knew actually died during that time. It was a very traumatic experience for me, and obviously for them and their families. And it was a very tough experience. So it's very unusual, I think, for someone to go to a privileged situation like a public school to then find themselves literally at the bottom of society. I was really, really wretched. I was in a terrible position. And I lost a lot of friends, of course, and just lost contact with friends. Didn't have mobiles in those days. And my poor parents. God, hello, Mum and Dad, if you're here. Sorry. So I literally nearly died on a few occasions, and I'm very lucky to be alive. And I've ever since then I've realised that. So how did that all change? Well, I was saved by the past. After about 5 years of being in the doldrums, I had always had a passion for archaeology and a great interest in the archaeological world and the relationship between humans, people, and the rest of nature. And archaeology really is a truly systemic science because, and I'm one I highly recommend to anyone thinking of university, the learning about humans and our past and how we interact with nature and the land is, I think, one of the best ways to learn about anything. I studied the advent of technology, the increase of trade around the world, starting right back in prehistoric times. I was particularly interested in the transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers and the rise of land ownership. And if you can see me, I don't know, I hope you can see my face on the screen. I'm holding up now my trowel from my archaeology days, which I've carved a silly thing into it. And during that time, I learned about the rise of land ownership. So as humans settled on the land, rather than being hunter-gatherers moving around, if you were trying to grow your crops, you needed to protect them. And so the idea that the advent of land ownership began. Property began. Property never would have crossed anyone's minds before then. Territory, yes, most mammals have territory, but property, the sense of ownership, no. With access to wealth gives, unfortunately, segregation and division in society, because there'll always be those people who want to control, and there'll be those who want to or who allow themselves to be led or be controlled. And with that comes class and divisions there, and religion and divisions there, and of course the politics that wraps it all together. And to me, I hope again you can see this. I'm holding up now. This is one of my most treasured possessions. This was found in my mother's rose bed in St John's Wood in London in the 60s by her landlady. And it's an Acheulean hand axe. And amazingly, this was made by Homo erectus. And it was made between 100,000 years ago and 500,000 years ago. I can't be exactly sure because we don't know the exact provenance, but it's very real and a very special part of my little collection, which I have here. Again, if you can see the screen, this box is full of very, very special things, which if I get the chance to talk to you guys again, I'll be very happy to show you further. So it was really, you know, Homo sapiens, the wise man, as it means in Latin, it really began to separate from the rest of nature. And we studied in archaeology the rise and fall of civilizations, the Celts through to the Romans and the Tudors, for example. And the period that we're in now, the Anthropocene, as people are now beginning to call it, is very much a time when one species, humans, are having a greater and perhaps worse impact on the rest of the world than any other could and or ever has. So after doing my archaeology, I studied it for a while, I worked in it for a while. I then went back to grown-up schoolroom, and that's called an office. And I also had a very well-paid, and I was totally unqualified job. This is in my sort of late 20s, mid to late 20s, 25 to 29, I think it was. And I worked for a company called Cabletron, doesn't exist anymore, $4 billion IT company. I became their head of services around EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa. Imagine that in your mid-20s, totally crazy. I had a 10 million budget. I had, £50,000 salary back then. We're talking, you know, that was big money then. And I bought that sports car. Not actually exactly the same as that. Mine was gunmetal grey. I couldn't find a picture of it for the talk. Anyway, I lived a life focused on career, individualism, as I was brought up to by Maggie, but not by my family, and chasing the buck, just like everybody else. And I did well. I was good at it. I was bright. I managed to sort myself out. I'd stopped drugs by that point, and really was beginning to feel really quite a driven young man. I did continue drinking alcohol, I have to say, and that's something I've only stopped having alcohol 2 years ago. And if I was to recommend anything to anybody, without wanting to sound like your parents, don't drink. It's not worth it. It really isn't very good for you. And I'm sure the wine industry would disagree with me. But if you want to be a serious professional and live in this hothouse world I'm talking about today, then I've learnt the long way. Intoxicating your body is not a good thing. So I had zero social conscience, just like my employer. And that's why I left, because I started to wake up. And I realized that actually the world's in a very, very difficult time. In 2001, I met my wife, Rebecca, and I grew a conscience and a pair of balls. I grew confident in what I was believing in, that after having such a hard time at school and not really believing a lot of what I was being taught about, I suddenly started to feel that I could see the world through different eyes. That before I left the corporate world, I met some very interesting people who worked in what is now called corporate social responsibility. I'm sure you've all heard of it. Was before then, it was called corporate culture. So you're looking around the late 90s, and I presented a proposal to the Cabletron vice president, very senior person, and I could hear it hit the floor as I left. They didn't take my proposal for sustainably managing the business very well, so I quit, and I went back to school again. Schumacher College, amazing place in Devon, still open. Highly recommend it for anybody interested in ecology, sustainability, and so on. Excuse me. And I lived in a medieval hall in Devon for a year. I studied a master's degree, so I'd already had my bachelor's from Bournemouth University, which was the main university for archaeology in those days, for practical archaeology. I went to, I got a holistic science master's degree, and as far as I'm concerned, learned how the world really works. In other words, natural complex systems where life evolves on the edge of chaos. So you may have heard of things like fringe theory or margins, the theory of margins. I don't know if you've covered that in biology yet. Well, the idea is that you've got lots of wibbly bits along the edge, and in those edges and those nooks of crannies, that's where life thrives. So if you look at ecology and woods, you're often told that birds like to live in a particular woods, and they're called a woodland species, but that they don't really exist. There are very, very few species that are woodland species. Most birds will live on the edge of woods, and in the old days, before humans came along, woods would have been in pockets because you had big herbivores coming along like elephants knocking the trees down, or oryx or beavers, and then in those they would live in the margins, in the scrub and the woodland and the open space, and humans did the same. So life evolves on the edges like that, and so does societies. So I'm going to show you a little film here. There's a strange case of slime mold. I'm going to press play, and I'm going to try and get the volume down so you can hear me talking. Slime mold taught me a huge amount. It's actually not a mold. It's a single-celled amoeba. I learnt about it at Schumacher College. And it behaves both individually and collectively, as you can see here. So these are tiny little amoeba, and then literally millions of them will get together and do something remarkable. So a chemical signal is sent out by one, it pulses like this. And this isn't the best film. There's an old one I can't find at the moment. But anyway, as you can see here, they start to conglomerate and come together, and they start to form a shape. Now, in this particular film, you won't be able to see this, but I can assure you they then form something a bit like a slug as one unit. Now, all those different cells are behaving as one, and they start to move with a turn screw movement. Then they find a spot and they set roots. So some of those cells can become other forms of cells. So they are totipotent, they become omnipotent, and they become specialist. And then, as you can see here, they start to grow and form a flower head. Now, unfortunately, in this particular film, it doesn't show the flower head bursting, but that actually happens in real life. So those single cells can take on many, many different functions, but they can't do it without each other. And that's what this taught me. It taught me about interconnectivity and the independence of things. And I studied lots and lots of other things that helped me see that. This is obviously very much on the micro scale, and a very important place to start. But then we need to look at whole ecosystems. So, for example, when you look at teachers like James Lovelock came and saw me. Now, he's someone you may have heard of. He's one of the leading climate scientists, and he taught me climate science. He stayed with us for a week. Jane Goodall, the amazing primatologist and biologist, she spent a week with us, 10 people on the course. Teddy Goldsmith, green economics, and so on. We had the world's leading figures in their subjects came and spent weeks at a time with us at Schumacher College. The most amazing education. And one of the things that really struck me the most was not just the interconnectivity and the interdependence of all things, but also that one can learn through poetry, through art, through a science of qualities as well as quantity. So they kill it, cut it up, put it under a microscope. That's very useful. But let's look at the whole living system as well. So I'm going to read you a poem. This may seem a bit odd for a talk about biology and life and conservation and things, but I learned that actually one of the best ways that you can be a good scientist or ecologist or conservationist is to use not only a microscope or a measuring device of some description, it's to use your words and your paintbrush. And in fact, naturalists, as scientists used to be called, were always incredibly draftspeople. They could draw beautiful things. They could write incredible words. This was written by me 17 years ago, just down the road from your school, along Back Lane. I was on the way back from the pub at the Bull. I had a couple of beers, and here we go. Badger of Back Lane. Most days, for the past few decades, a bone-deep pleasure has been bristled and white-striped to me by the badgers of Back Lane. We share this nook of Berkshire, warm-blooded and canine-toothed into familiarity. At every glimpse of their earthy excavations, I feel the thrill of their digging, their spoil mounding on the tarmac of this winding Stanford Dingley Lane. Every now and again, you see the trundling pace of a low-slung chap out hunting, beetles and worms and grubbing, and you see you slow the engine, swing out wide, giving him the due birth and respect he deserves. He lives on a mere slip of a hill with ivy-draped oaks, pigeons, neat hedges and banks either side. We had a recent conversation, I, bipedal and bald, with a man who is as hairy, narrow-mouthed and blind as the corner of his roadside home. Whilst chatting with the subterranean of dark tunnels, dry grass bedding and dangling roots, he mumbles a warning, some nonsense about tuberculosis, apparently. His lot is lower than cash crops and factory cows, slandered with poisonous whirls. The howls of terriers dig out this old Brock. 2 species, 1 kingdom, 6 feet on the ground. We had a discussion, unheard, garrulous, without words, over a bottle of beer as I strode home. He seemed not to care for his fate, nor my shadow, but I do, for both of his, fueled by roses aglow, red-cheeked from an evening at the Bull Inn. But only 2 months ago I stood beside him and gazed in awe at his manners, our plain similarity, his bold persona, incessant scratching at visible fleas, calmly ducking into his set, reversing in and out, shy of prying automobiles. 3 times he'd return to sniff the air, cast a nonchalant glance at my feet, look up and melt my heart in the full moon of his fur. Today I saw him again, sprawled by his back door, drunk on a night's foraging, spread on his belly, eternally yawning. Although ruffled round the edges and covered in dust, he was surprisingly animated and soft to touch, since the cruel wheels of a speeding truck. Now, I'm not going to analyse that now with you. You can do it for yourselves, but you probably get the picture there. That's a combination of love of nature and, again, having one's heart broken by a simple thing as running over a badger. So whilst I started to see the intrinsic value and beauty in all things, the disconnection with the rest of nature is actually making us ill. We've all seen with COVID and the lockdown, this has been a great thing for many people in the countryside in that they can get outside more, get away from computer screens. But actually, if you're like me, you spend most of your time in front of one. And the disconnection from nature that we've witnessed really is, I think, an endemic and has been proven psychologically speaking. Eco-psychologists even exist now who will talk about addiction, depression, dementia, even nature deficit disorder, which is something you'll learn about if you follow the philosophical route in the future. Even ecological tidiness disorder. We flail and mow everything in straight lines. That didn't happen when I grew up. Literally every hedgerow was bushy and wild. The idea of a straight clipped hedgerow a metre by a metre just wouldn't have crossed anyone's minds. So since that period, I have been on a bit of a mission, and that is to help reconnect people with the rest of nature and work together to solve big and urgent problems. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I'm hoping that some of this will be covered in class, but the world provides, nature provides, it provides our food, our homes, our drink. It gives us everything we need for our economy and that we depend on for our planetary systems. Nature provides about $125 trillion worth of ecosystem services each year, but they're not valued. They are not valued. So if you're a business, you can go out and extract any raw mineral you like for free. The only cost is the cost of extraction. You don't have to pay anyone for it. When you pollute, you don't have to pay for polluting. Sometimes you do, but most people don't. So we basically have this very unreasonable relationship with nature where we pollute nature, we extract from nature, but we do nothing to pay for it. The ecological footprint in the UK, 65 million or so people live there. We have something called a biocapacity deficit of 4.8 global hectares per person. And we're the 10th worst ecological footprint in the world, 10th worst out of 218 countries. And if all 7.5 billion of us lived like us, then we'd need 4 planet Earths. Climate breakdown. Now, I'm sure you talked about this at class. We've had, these figures are constantly updating, and these figures are reasonably accurate. It's a roughly 18 or 19 of the hottest years on record have been in the past 20 years. And that's during your lives, all of them. And that's going back nearly 1 million years. So the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015, we set a target of approximately 2 degrees, 1.5 to 2 degrees. But we've already hit 1.15 degrees in the past year or two. And we could be very seriously looking at 6 degrees centigrade. Now, that probably doesn't sound like much, but it really is. That means no ice. It literally means no ice. It means an uninhabitable world for us and most wildlife. So this is a very serious problem. And with the parts per million of carbon dioxide now going up again in my lifetime, I was born at around 280 parts per million. It is now 410, probably 420 now. So how are we going to meet these net zero emissions as we've committed to in law by 2050? Well, we'll come to that shortly. We also mustn't forget wildlife. So it's not just about the atmosphere. And you can see on the left of the screen here that there's some pretty similar signs of things going up, and the upward movement isn't good. The 6th mass extinction is happening around us all at this moment in time. And there are, of all the millions of species in existence now, the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report has estimated around 60% of wildlife populations have been lost since I was born. That's a frightening thought, and the same as of biodiversity decrease as well. So not just the number of wildlife, but also the diversity in them. This is a very serious situation, and it's exacerbated by, of course, our over-exploitative nature as humans, but also by invasive species, by pollution and climate change, and so on. So it's a very complex situation here. We live in a hothouse world. I gave this talk, the subject title of Hothouse World, living in a hothouse world. This picture is in Australia, very near to where my family lives. Another part of my family, my mother's side, who lived near Sydney and Melbourne, and I'm sure you're all well aware that the devastating effect on humans and wildlife has been catastrophic. I mean, the fruit bat population decline has been quite frankly terrifying, and we have also, I dare to say, this is the depressing part of the talk, the figures, in my opinion, as a scientist, are incorrect and too conservative. What they don't account for on current projections is the fact of the matter that methane, which is being released very quickly in the north, as you're probably aware, with permafrost melting, for example, is 7 times more impactful than carbon dioxide. And nobody ever talks about the 40-year time lag. So when I emit gas as an individual, or a cow, it takes a very long time for that to have an immediate impact. If it's methane, then it's quite a quick impact. If it's carbon dioxide, it can take up to 40 years. So the emissions that we're releasing now are not actually going to be felt until you guys are parents or maybe even grandparents. So we've got to act now. And we mustn't also forget that in this situation that humans have a tendency for conflict, unfortunately. And as an archaeologist, in my box of stones here, you know, a lot of these are weapons. I've got an arrowhead in here, for example. We can also see that our culture and our politics is changing rapidly, and that we have the rise of populism and nationalism. There's quite an anti-science trend, thanks to Donald Trump and others. And of course, consumerism underlying it all is rampant. The attitude of get off my land, I can only see, I'm afraid, getting worse if we have scant resources and we see people moving from the global south to the north, away from the very hot equator. Then we are, I'm afraid, going to see many millions of people displaced, and we already are. Now, that's going to put a lot of pressure on our resources. So as young people, I would implore upon you, think about this. When you're thinking about your career decisions and you're thinking about what to do in life, bear in mind the world you're in now is not, I'm afraid, going to be that way. And I hope I'm not saying anything that would cause stress or upset to you, but I've worked in this my entire career, and it is really happening. So we as parents and adults, we need to help and teach you to become resilient and to be ready for, I'm not saying the end of the world, but just a different world that is going to be in some ways beautiful and wonderful, and in other ways challenging. And if you're a scientist called Jem Bendell, I'm afraid there are lots of people out there who are saying that there is an economic collapse due any day now. And we can see already that there have been a lot of things that have come close to that. So to me, it's not just about mitigating climate change, it's about adaptation. Right, quick run through my career. I won't spend too long on this, but I thought you might be interested to see some of the things I've been up to since I left Schumacher College. So the past sort of 18 years, 20 years, I spent most of that time setting up organizations that are, I hope, pioneering or trying to pioneer new technologies or work with pioneering people who do. I set up an organization called Sustainate in 2004. It was the UK's first CSR network, and we used to hold conferences at PricewaterhouseCoopers headquarters, and we'd have about 300 people from the political world, from investments, from technology and entrepreneurs, and so on, all coming together to try and understand the hockey stick curve, as it was called then. It probably isn't a phrase you've heard of, but it's the carbon emission curve looks a bit like a hockey stick. And we were the first people in Britain to present this to the science and entrepreneurial and political community. And I remember very clearly when I was chairing that meeting in 2004, having to kick out a bunch of people from the oil lobby because they stood up shouting and saying we were lying. Can you believe it? Well, people did then, and still do, I'm afraid. At the same time, the Financial Times were sitting next to them, taking notes and reporting it. So it's quite a momentous occasion. I did this with colleagues to try and connect people with money and the know-how to try and solve problems. One of the ideas we came up with was something called One Earth. we developed the business model for it and proposal, and we took it to Al Gore's team. Al Gore was nearly president a few years ago, and he then took the idea. He's kept the logo. That circle there is our idea, and then he delivered 7 concerts around the world with people like Madonna singing in different cities. Very exciting time and trying to raise awareness of what's going on. I then moved into clean technology and green finance, and I set up a whole load of different businesses. They were all sort of social enterprises. Some of them were for profit, but I never took an interest in them. I've never really been interested in that side of things. When I say interest, I mean financial interest. And I realized that for me, communications alone and networking wasn't really enough. I wanted to be involved in something a bit more practical and hands-on. So we were involved in trying to set up a whole load of different technology-focused organisations, and I can assure you now, I know what failure's like. And if my wife was listening to me, she would be agreeing and nodding furiously. I'm afraid if you're an entrepreneur, and if any of you go down that route, you will experience failure, and it's a good thing because you learn. So the Research Exchange we set up, we raised £1 million about 15 years ago, and had money to spend, a lot of money to spend on the sorts of technologies in these pictures. And unfortunately, the tax regime was changed by Gordon Brown overnight, literally overnight, without any warning at all. And what happened? Our business collapsed and all our investors lost their money. No fault of ours at all, but that's the nature of the global financial system. It is not secure. We set up eco-cities to develop a project in Dongtang in China and build a whole new eco-city. We set up eco-shelter for disaster relief, sort of pop-up shelters that were insulated, and also for protected crops and growing vegetables and fruit. RenPro for funding renewable energy technologies. And lastly, Empower Community, which is still running. It's got about 40 million of assets under management. It's a social housing solar product. And by using institutional finance from the pensions, insurance industry, banks and so on, we were able to leverage that finance very considerably and put solar on the roofs of social housing, which was a wonderful thing and is doing really well. I then had the gift of life. I became a daddy. Look at those lovely girls. They're now a bit older than that. Flora's 13, Annabelle's 12. And those 2 bundles of joy really changed everything for me. So having been quite a sort of selfishly focused person, as we all are, suddenly I'm a father. Yes, I was married by then with Rebecca, but we would then have to think about the next generation. What are we going to do? How are we going to make sure they have a sustainable future? And suddenly everything other than money mattered, and became even more of a passionate nutter for the climate and the environment. So I set up some other things which were related to that. Canopy and Stars, which if you know, if you're into glamping, you've probably booked holiday through Canopy and Stars. That treehouse there was my first project with colleagues Alistair Sorday and Tom Dixon. And over time, Tom then ran the organisation. I just helped set it up, and became and he's still a leading glamping organisation, and great fun. We also were involved in city centre regeneration through Sorday's Ventures, which I was the chief executive of, and urban regeneration. And interestingly, felt the harsh end of corruption as well, I'm afraid. We were involved in a city centre regeneration scheme, which I should have put a picture in here. It was rather beautiful, but it didn't happen because someone took a backhander in the council and we lost the deal, £250,000, and the person was sacked. I'm not sure if you think that's a fair deal, but sacking someone, I think prison would have been more appropriate. But there we go. These things do happen, I'm afraid. The world is a wonderful place, but there's corruption, so keep your eye out. And we also started working with landowners and farmers. But I did also, we had a very difficult time 7 years ago, and it's important. I nearly didn't include this in my talk, but I want you to see me as a human with a real story, not just as a businessman and an entrepreneur. My wonderful wife Becca was diagnosed with cancer 7 years ago, and she nearly didn't make it through and had very, very extensive surgery. She bounced back, but unfortunately was re-diagnosed 2 years ago. However, she is strong and fit now. She lives with cancer, and it's always there as a threat. For our daughters, it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to live with, but it's normal. They don't have memories before mummy had cancer. So for me, again, having become a father, and then the love of my life, having this constant threat, it really does drive you. I pray to God that none of you have to go through anything like that in your lives. But I'm not going to say much more before I start wibbling. But it's a very difficult thing to learn with. But it also is a gift, extraordinarily. Some people say cancer is a gift, and I now understand why, because it certainly slaps you in the face, as I have said there. We then dived a bit deeper. I set up an organisation called Necton Foundation. On the top left, you can see Obama. I gave a presentation in front of John Kerry. We had about 800 people tune into our expedition in 2016. And we had film stars coming and diving with us and talking about ocean health and how the ocean is suffering because of climate change and all the life in it. And of course, the ocean is the planet's lungs just as much as the Amazon is. So it's very, very important that we understand ocean health. And we had an exciting time. I'm just going to show you a quick 1 minute film, which is a trailer of the expedition, and I'll shut up for a moment. If it works. Oh dear. Right. Okay. I don't think I'm going to waste too much time. That's really annoying. This worked in all the tests that I did, of course. One more time. You got the slime mold video, but you didn't get the exciting submarines underwater, which is far more exciting. Go away, thingy. I think I don't want to spend too long doing this. Thank you for being patient. As you can see, I've got a thing on the screen here that's popping up, and it's not. Okay, right. I'm really sorry about that. That was a really. Oh, shall I try one more time? Yes, there we go. Turn the volume up.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Mission Control, this is Triton 1. Preparing to descend. Yeah, copy that. Depth 100 meters. We're entering the twilight zone.
Oh, still get a tingle when I see that. We had a lot of fun on that expedition, and I'm very happy to answer questions about that later. I wouldn't be surprised if someone wants to know more about that. So we went and explored the ocean, and it was incredible, a bit depressing. A lot of what we found was very, very low quality coral reef around Bermuda itself. A lot of trashing from fishing, the invasive lionfish from the Caribbean, from the Indian Ocean, and many other problems. You'll be aware of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are some of them. There are lots. And I've always found that as a useful framework for trying to focus my work within. And the development of enterprises and solutions, trying to know where they fit into the scheme of things. Most recently, I've been involved in biodiversity as well as climate, and that's why I put these ones up here. Just a really reminder for you that we actually have targets and we are not hitting them. So after Necton, I then, rather than set up an organisation, I joined one called Blue Ventures with an amazing guy called Al Harris, who set it up 15 years before, and he brought me in with my business experience to try and help develop the organisation from around 150 staff to about 250 and double the turnover to something like 10 million or whatever it was. And I did this because as I said there, having spent about £5 million on one expedition to Bermuda and a couple of years of research and setting up a science lab at Oxford, that's a lot of money. Imagine what that could do in Madagascar, working with poor semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes who use dugout canoes, with a lady like that who's probably in her late teens, maybe I'll be a mother already. You can see the fish drying above her. She's cooking there using charcoal. There's a lot of problems with health and inhalation of fumes. There's no sanitation, no electricity, and so on. An incredible life, but also a very challenging one. And when I went to Madagascar for a few weeks to experience that, I was very much struck by the beauty and the kindness of these amazing people, but also how literally just offshore, while we were trying to help them to conserve their local economy and and protect their future, we also literally saw great big Chinese trawlers scooping up all the life off the bottom of the sea. Now, I wish I could ask a question to you all, but I can't. I would be saying, what do you think this is? I will tell you, it's an elephant bird eggshell, and you may know that the elephant bird lived on Madagascar and only became extinct a few hundred years ago. It may sound like a prehistoric beast, but it is literally only a few hundred years ago. This shell weighs something, and it was the size of a rugby ball. So this, to me, is extinction in my hands. I showed you the hand axe earlier. This represents the technology that humans can create, albeit a very simple version, and this is what can happen with very simple things like stones and bits of pottery. So, for example, this bit of pottery I found just next to the eggshell, which showed very clearly to me as an archaeologist that the egg had been removed from an elephant bird and then cooked using that pottery. So, learning from Blue Ventures, I saw very quickly how important it is to focus on the local and the small as much as it is to do the really sexy stuff, you know, the deep sea expeditions. So it was bringing it all home back to Blighty. So with the climate breakdown and the mass extinctions that we're seeing now, we are still striving for growth within our economy. We have this tendency, I think it's probably a neo-colonial mindset. It's still ingrained in us that we're colonists and colonizers, and obviously we're not, but we do have a tendency to offshore. We offshore our tax. You know, a lot of people have their wealth held offshore, so they don't have to pay tax on it. We offshore our emissions, so we pay people in other parts of the world, you know, so-called developing nations, rather than clear up our own crap. We get someone else to do it for us. So we're very good at saving tigers, but not very good at saving wildcats in Britain. And I think one of the key messages from Madagascar for me was that we need to stop that offshoring and we need to focus back at home. So let's look at England, Britain for a moment. We are the 29th most nature depleted country out of 218 in the world. That is shameful. It is the most shocking statistic that I have ever seen, and is one that I will never forget unless it gets worse, which sadly it might. We're the worst state of nature in the whole of Europe, and I'm including the much more impoverished Eastern European countries. We are frankly buggered in many respects. And again, excuse my language, but it's important you get this message across. We have a very, very poor level of biodiversity and bioabundance in this country. You guys were born into it, so you probably don't know any different. I do. I remember it, and your teachers will remember it. And you know, when you see figures like this, 100% of our rivers are polluted. Every single river is polluted. Every single river. We have 30 to 40 years of fertility in our soil because the soil's being washed off or trashed. We have 75% of our land is under cultivation, but 70% of that 75 is for meat, either for rearing animals or feeding animals. Why? I mean, I love meat, but really, do we need that much meat? Of course we don't. The insects that pollinate our plants that we then feed us are in massive decline, and the biodiversity, species biodiversity drops in this country are horrific. So I think we need to wild ourselves. I'm not suggesting that we should be, you know, not having, you know, modern industrial scale farming and things. It just needs to be done better. It needs to be done regeneratively. And so since I left Blue Ventures 2 years ago, I've been doing something new, which is to set up an organization, which I'm about to tell you about before I finish this talk. And that is to try and help people in Britain to solve Britain's problems, to develop and scale nature-based solutions. So as you've gathered, a lot of my work has been involved, and I'm not alone. There are lots of people like me who've been involved in technology. And as you've probably seen in recent times, we have been able to focus our energies much more onto the restoration of our countryside, using wild animals, using nature-based solutions, rather than to just put technology into things. So we have the beaver. The beaver is, as far as I'm concerned, the ultimate natural climate solution. To me, that means that they are low cost, they are easy to manage, they can breathe life back into our lands. And I run the Beaver Trust. The Beaver Trust is an organisation that has started to work with governments and various different stakeholders to try and reintroduce this native animal to help reduce floods and droughts. And I'll be very happy to, I've just had a nod to say it's time to wrap up. So I'm going to wrap up in a moment, and we can talk a little bit about the beaver and what the beaver can do, because it's something that I'm doing right now, and quite possibly not far from school. Some of the projects I'm looking at are very close by. And the beavers have been a great inspiration to me and the work that we're doing. Before I wrap, I'm going to show you this little clip. It's only a minute long, and I hope it will play. And let's see. This is a film that I've just made, or rather, it's an advert for a film. Beavers without borders. So I'll tell you in the questions and discussion, I can tell you more about that. But to wrap up then, guys, it's been a real privilege to talk to you. I hope you found it interesting. I quite frankly could probably bore the pants off you for hours and hours and hours. It's been a really exciting and interesting career that I've had. You've heard that I've had some very significant difficulties in my life. That happens, and it toughens you up, and it shouldn't, I hope, do anything to try and diminish from our efforts to make the world a better place. And for me, it looks like we need some hothouse education where we can help prepare you guys for the future, have a wilder approach to education with outdoor classrooms, introducing natural systems thinking to what we do, reconnecting you with each other and the natural world that will be sustaining you. And my final thing I'd like to say is to share with you is a letter that imaginary letter I wrote this evening ahead of this talk to my girls. Dear girls, this is my conscience writing about your inheritance. I'm so sorry you have to clear up my mess. Our toxic system is yet to crash, and until it does, despite some efforts, we are hooked on greed, profit and consumption. I'm obviously writing this with my tongue in my cheek as well. We know we need to invest billions in saving our hospitable planet, but we haven't quite accepted it yet. Yes, I know things don't look great, but there is hope. We have Joe Biden, Greta Thunberg, our children and cricket. If you are wondering what to do with your life, make sure you tread lightly, help others, build resilient communities, adapt and change, be prepared, be useful, make friends. So while I have had it, I suggest you forget personal wealth because it's not real really or permanent, and focus on health, happiness and kindness, because that is all that matters. I did my best. I hope it was enough. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, James. That was really, really interesting. A few of us have already put some questions in the question and answer boxes. And I've got another question. I should have that in the next few minutes. That'd be great. Shall we start with one here for James? So how have you managed to sustain your interest in this topic over such a long period of time?
Oh, what a lovely question. That's a brilliant question, whoever asked that. Well, as you can tell, I'm quite a passionate person, and it takes a lot to get me down. So I think probably one way of doing it is what motivates me. The story that I've just told you shows my motivation for trying to help other people. I know what it's like to suffer, and I know what it's like to be in pretty difficult situations, and that breeds compassion and empathy. So if there's one thing of many, I suppose, that I would encourage you all to, as you grow up, is to always keep an eye on kindness. There's a primary school up the road from us here in the neighbouring village, and they have one school rule, and it is 2 words: be kind.
Fab, similar to our Faulkner's motto. The next question is, do you think young people today care less about nature and wildlife than in the past? And if so, why do you think that?
No, I don't. I don't at all. I feel sad because, as I've said, I have been, and people older than me have witnessed more wildlife in this countryside than you have, but I hope it will return. And so if anyone feels a sense of disconnection, it is absolutely not their fault. It is the way they've been brought up in the society that we're in now. And that is no individual family's problem either. It's a systemic issue. So no, and in fact, you know, I'm a father. I have 13 and 12-year-old girls. They are hugely passionate artists, dancers, slug and caterpillar picker-uppers, rugby playing girls as well, I have to add, campers and so on. So I know they're not alone. We have lots of friends of our family who care a lot. So no, I think absolutely not. And also I'll answer the why part as well. I think a lot of it is because your generation has this digital world to live through, and it isn't real. And you know that. And anyone who spends, as I do, a long period of time on screens, both handheld and desktop and the rest of it, we have to step outside of it. And so we need to invest in our relationships. And the natural world is obviously the biggest relationship that we can have.
Fab. The next one is, what would you say, besides your intrinsic passion for wildlife, drove you to become motivated again after such a difficult period of time?
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, I haven't given a talk like this before, by the way. I've never ever shared what I've just shared with you, and I'm doing it because you're my old school. And maybe I'll do it again sometime for some other lucky people. But I think it was the sense of near fatal collapse, and it really was. I was in a very bad way, and having a glimmer of hope from the kindness and love shown by my parents and my siblings, Ben and Nick. And I think, well, I said archaeology in the past, didn't I, in my talk? It really was a huge thing for me because I started to see how I fitted in and my place in the world, and through time and history, not only in the present. So by seeing a context like that, it helps give you a sense of person and place. And so really, ever since I studied archaeology, which happened right after I had the drug problems and the other things that went wrong in life, it gave me a real sense of purpose. And as soon as I learned about humans, I could not but help learn about nature and that interconnectivity that I've been talking about. So I think really that's given me my passion and my enthusiasm and my commitment, alongside being a father, of course, which came later. Great.
So this wasn't a planted question, but can you tell us why beavers could make such a difference to biodiversity?
Yeah, I'm sorry I had to cut that short, but we did agree that I was going to speak for just 45 minutes, and I lost a couple of minutes for that film cock up earlier. Yes, beavers are extraordinary. Now, they lived in this country until only a few hundred years ago. They're native. They evolved over 7.5 million years with all the wildlife that live here now. So when you go out fishing for a brown trout, those brown trout evolved to jump over beaver dams into the ponds behind them, where, having spawned, they would then grow into adults. When you're looking at the slowing of floodwaters and drought, unfortunately, as you all know, because you see it around you in the news, or maybe even in your homes, we have a big problem with water, the shortage or too much of it. We can't really make our minds up. And beavers can help with that because they slow the flow. They raise the water table. And I don't know if any geographers on the call and hydrologists, but you'll find that there'll be a change, even in chalk landscapes where we live around this area. You'll find that there's a completely different feel to the hydrology and to the ecology of an area. So you have a mosaic of habitats that provide much greater opportunity for life. And by slowing the water, you have all those little organisms, all the zooplankton and so on. They feed the invertebrates, the insects. They feed the fish that feed the bigger fish and the birds and so on. So it goes up the food web. And it means that beavers, just simply by making dams and churning things around a bit, and doing some other things like coppicing that lets light in, it creates the opportunity for life and sequesters carbon at the same time. So it helps us in the climate situation as well. I could say a lot more, but they're pretty awesome animals. In fact, I'll tell you what I will say, Joe, because you've heard me say this before. They are an ecosystem engineer. That's a great term. So some people call them not a species, but an ecosystem engineer, because they literally, there's nothing like them. Well, elephants, I suppose you might like them, but they haven't lived here for a long time.
So hopefully over the next year or so, we're going to learn a lot more about beavers. So keep your eye open for more beaver information coming up. There's a few really great questions that I'd just like to finish up with. One of them is, runaway climate change is the result of a runaway capitalism. Can we control capitalism, or is a revolution the only hope?
Oh, I can hear there's an interesting person on the call today. I'd like to meet you. Well, you're a man or woman after my own heart, because I'm afraid, as you may have noticed from my talk, I've been working this for so many years. And although I'm not an economist by trade, I've obviously had to be, I've had to learn a lot about it. And because economics and politics are one and the same, and sociology, and ecology and so on. I'm afraid I'm not that hopeful for capitalism as it stands. Capitalism there isn't a problem with capitalism, but when it was written by people like Adam Smith, they didn't imagine that something like a company could be bigger than a nation state, let alone the size of the world, like a Microsoft or something. So the origins of capitalism just weren't regulated in the way that they need to be. And so, of course, now, as anyone studying, say, for example, A-level economics should hopefully be picking up on, that they don't have the checks and balances in place. So, as I said earlier on, if you're extracting from nature and you're not paying for it, and you're polluting and not paying for it, it's not a true cost. Your business model is flawed. You're getting a very good deal, and then you add in subsidies on top of that. It means you can effectively be paid by the government using our tax to do damage. So that needs to change. Now, I personally would like to think that capitalism can sort itself out, but I'm afraid in the 20 years I've been working full time on this very subject, trying to offer solutions, there really hasn't been any improvement at all. There are little piecemeal bits. I'm not going to give up, and I would never encourage people to give up, but I'm afraid there probably needs to be a bit of a collapse to happen, and I think it's inevitable. Like Jem Bendel says earlier on in my talk, I think realistically, if I were you, I would be putting more effort, and I shouldn't be dissuading anyone from being an accountant, for example, but if you're going to be an accountant, measure things that matter, like the cost of nature. If you're going to be a lawyer, measure and protect, rather, the wildlife in the world that we live in, because that's going to be very, very important in law. And if you're going to be a business person, for example, then make sure your business is a beneficial one and good for the world.
Fab. And I've got a loaded question here.
Oh, yeah.
Which is an interesting one. Having experienced poverty yourself, do you think the billions being spent on climate change would be better off combating other global issues such as poverty?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that there is no bigger problem than climate change, and all sources of poverty will ultimately be caused by it. And the simple reason is that because of human displacement, so for example, the problems in Sudan, Syria and so on, those are climate problems. If you have an insecure and frankly bad despotic leader, and they take advantage of people, then unfortunately those people are going to be either ejected from their home or feel unsafe. And that all was because, for example, in Ethiopia a long time ago when this all started, people can't grow crops, they can't feed themselves, so there's no economy. And if there's no economy, there's nowhere to feed people, and so you have infighting, and when infighting happens, you spread out. So the billions, it's billions of cost. It's not a cost, it's an investment. It is not a cost to save the planet, it's an investment in your future. And so we do not have a choice. We have to put money into climate, and by doing that, we put it into health, into education, into poverty alleviation, and break it down nicely like that. You can't extrapolate and set them out separately. And I should imagine Joe could talk to you a lot more about that in class, but it's a very, very important tenet to our understanding of the future. Poverty is caused by climate change. It's caused by extinction. The COVID crisis is caused by humans living right up against wild animals and having them in our abattoirs and so on, as you've probably heard. It's a climate problem that has caused the COVID crisis. There you go. Perfect example. A sad one, but real. Very good question.
It was a good question, wasn't it? Maybe last question brings together two of the parts of your history, really. So how effective do you think corporate social responsibility is in terms of bringing actual long-term social changes, as many corporations claiming to be good are actually simultaneously doing bad things?
Yeah, I mean, the term greenwash was coined 2 decades ago. Well, is there such a thing as a truly good corporation? I'd like to think there is, but I haven't actually ever found one. There are very good people within corporations, and some of the people on this call's parents and my friends work in, and my brother, for example, who mean very well and do good things. But it's the system that's the issue here. So as long as corporations are not properly regulated, which are not anywhere in the world, then they will carry on because they can carry on polluting until regulation comes into place. which is one of the reasons why I work very closely with Zach Goldsmith, Rebecca Powell, Victoria Prentice, George Eustace, the 4 DEFRA ministers and Secretary of State. I'm in touch with them every week about this very subject. How can we regulate the water polluters, the sewage, the water companies that release sewage? They literally millions of tons of raw sewage is released into our rivers every year because they can. So regulation is absolutely the key. And if that happens, then corporations can behave better. And why not? Well, they have no choice. They will have to comply with the rules and they will be incentivized. So I'll give you a quick example, if Joe wouldn't mind me fitting this in, because it's quite an interesting one. I've just developed a program that I positioned to Zach Goldsmith, the Minister for Environment, and Rebecca Powell, and it's for river buffers. So imagine you're a farmer and you're used to getting quite a nice income for ploughing right up to the edge of the river, but unfortunately there's no space for wildlife and the river's being polluted by the runoff from your fields and the chemicals. If we were to pay you, the government was to pay you to set your land back, then that space would be allowing riparian, so riverine habitat restoration, beavers, for example, to live, and other animals. And it means that you as a farmer will be paid a really healthy chunk of money to do that. So why wouldn't you do it? If you're paid the same or more than your income. So if you're looking at industrial farming and you combine regulation of, say, the egg industry, I've just joined as an advisor to River Action. I highly recommend you look it up, riveractionuk.org or .com. I'm one of the advisory board members there, and we are targeting, in a positive way, the food industry, and it's polluting at the moment. So there you go. A real corporation, Noble Foods, has had a letter from us just last week where we're asking them to clean up their act, because as the biggest chicken producer and egg producer in the country, they are completely killing the River Wye. I'm not blaming them, it's because they're not regulated. So we need regulation, we need financial incentivization, and we need good human beings inside those organizations to do responsible and correct things.
Fab. Thank you, James. I think we've had a real breadth of questions there that shows that our student body is really interested in what you have to talk about, and there's lots of thanks as well in the question and answer boxes. So everyone's really appreciated your time this evening, and we hope that you can come and see us for real one day soon and talk to us a bit more once we're all back in school.
Oh, well, thank you.
We look forward to that. And yeah, if anyone has any questions that they want to take up further with James, if you can email me, jfode, and I can pass them on. OK, but I wish everyone was able to give you a round of applause now, because I know that they all appreciated it. They've said lots of nice things.
Oh,
OK,
thanks, Jane.
So thank you everyone for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing James again soon.
Yeah, I'll be delighted. Well, when I can, maybe I'll come into class and we can have a proper chat. This was meant to be in the hall, wasn't it, the lecture hall? But there we go. Thank you, Joe, very much for hosting me, and to Karen Ward, who organised this, and to Rob for facilitating. I'm very grateful.